Okay, so hi, my name is Sebastian Budin. I'm a founding member of Historical Materialism Journal and the book series and the conferences, some of which you will already be familiar with. So I wanted just to pitch to you the idea of you subscribing to the journal, firstly. The journal comes out 4 times a year, published by Brill, over 1,000 pages of extremely important and stimulating Marxist theory and Marxist history. We have a discount at the moment for individual subscribers around the time of the London conference, and we very strongly both request and demand that you subscribe to the journal, that you get other people to subscribe to the journal, and of course that you get your institution, if you're part of a university or other institution, to subscribe to the journal. We need more subscribers for this project to be able to expand and continue. The second thing I really wanted to push was the book series. The book series you will also probably be familiar with. It's published by Brill Academic Press, and then all the volumes come out 12 months later with Haymarket Books in Chicago, paperbacks. We have more than 200 volumes published now, of translations, of original work, of document collections, of translations from Marxist theory from across the world, from Japan to China to India to Latin America, very important Latin American list shaping up in the book series, and so on. It's a really crucial intervention in Marxist literature and in making Marxist theory available that really hasn't existed on this scale since the 1970s. So we'd like you to look at the book series, buy individual volumes, perhaps take up the offer of the book club that Haymarket is promoting. And also, of course, if you're part of an institution, to get your institution to buy as many volumes as possible. Those are the 2 key elements of our activity, aside from the conferences, the journal and the book series. And we think it would be, it's essential basically for us, for our existence, for us to be able to continue to thrive, for those to expand. So please subscribe to the journal, buy the books in the book series, publicize both around you, and help us build the Historical Materialism project. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you for attending this penultimate session of the Historical Materialism 2021 online conference. My name is Sebastian Budin. I'm an editor of Historical Materialism Journal and a member of the editorial board for the HM book series. The title of this session, this penultimate session, is Marxism, Ecology, Politics. And we have 4 speakers, David Schwartzman, Camilla Royle, Feyzi Ismail, and Jordan Kinder. Obviously a highly relevant session in the context, in the current conjuncture, which I don't think I need to remind anybody about. Usual format, 15 or so minutes each, time for the speakers to interact with each other. And also we will be taking questions on the YouTube chat. So if you have a question, please put it on the YouTube chat, and we can then read them out and ask the speakers to respond. So first up is David. David Schwartzman is a retired professor from Howard University, an active eco-socialist, member of the Science and Society editorial board, currently preparing a special issue on eco-socialism to come out, I think, next year, and a natural scientist by training. David is also the article of a very interesting article in Science and Society. Some of you may have read about solar communism. Title of David's paper is A Critique of Degrowth in the Context of a Global Green New Deal, an Eco-Socialist Perspective. So, David, over to you.
Yes, thank you to the organizers for this opportunity. I really appreciate this chance to present this paper, and I presented some of it in the last in-person historical materialism conference 2019 with the title, The Thermodynamics of Communism. So I'm sharing my screen. I'm going to show a few slides, but I will start with the positive contributions of the degrowth proponents. In particular, they're rethinking of economic growth under capitalism, critiquing its measure, the GNP, GDP, recognizing capitalism unsustainable use of natural resources, in particular fossil fuels, in its production of commodities for profit generation, regardless of their impact on the health of people and the environment. But degrowth solutions are highly flawed, and their brand is not likely to be welcomed by the global working class, even as it attracts sections of the so-called professional class. As Matt Huber put it, lifestyle environmentalism will never win over workers. The degrowth discourse commonly fails to unpack the qualitative aspects of economic growth, lumping all in one basket. Sustainable, addressing essential needs of humans and nature, versus unsustainable, leaving the majority of humanity in poverty in or worse. Here's an example, actually a quotation from George Monbiot. Perpetual growth on a finite planet leads inexorably to environmental calamity. This common assertion, very common assertion, fails to deconstruct the qualitative aspects of growth. What is growing? What should degrow? Under what energy regime, which is particularly critical. Another assertion of the degrowthists, they say the global material and energy throughput has to degrow, starting with those nations that are ecologically indebted to the rest. Energy and material throughput have to degrow because materials extracted from the earth cause huge damage to ecosystems and to the people that depend on them. In contrast, with respect to material throughput, we have argued that it should actually increase globally in an eco-socialist transition as a culmination of a Green New Deal. In an eco-socialist transition, at least as we envision it, the plan would not be simply for degrowth, but for complete phasing out of the military-industrial complex. The disappearance of this complex would liberate vast quantities of materials, especially metals, for creation of a global wind and solar power infrastructure. Degrowthers point to the alleged privileged status of workers in the global north as a big part of the problem, instead of recognizing that the transnational working class will not only benefit from growth of sectors that meet its needs in both the global north and south, but must be the leading force to defeat fossil capital. Leading degrowthers advocate a global reduction. I emphasize global reduction in energy consumption, a prescription for mass suicide for most of humanity, because it will condemn them to a state of energy poverty even worse than present, as well as prevent the creation of a wind solar power capacity necessary for climate adaptation and mitigation, make it impossible to meet the 1.5 degree C global warming target, increasing the potential for climate catastrophe with horrors much worse than we now witness. Now, in the next slide, oh, I just covered this one, sorry. This slide is very important because it shows the relationship of the life expectancy by nation with the energy use per capita. And the red arrow here points to the global south.
David,
yes.
Can I stop you? We can't actually see any of your slides. You haven't shared your screen.
I thought I did.
No.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Especially if you're getting to graphics, it might be useful.
I did click share screen. What's that doing? Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought I clicked it. Here, let's go back to this one then. Just a second. I just have to get the slideshow again.
Yeah, we have a few seconds to spy on the contents of your desktop.
Yeah, I just want to get my, there we go. Okay. Let me get the chat off of the screen. So I'm sorry. I shared it now. Oh, it just takes a few seconds to there it is. Can you all see this slide now?
Yeah, we can all see it.
Yeah. Okay, so the global south falls below the highest life expectancy achievable in the world, and they commonly have energy consumption per capita that's less than a minimum, which Ismail originally pointed to. The United States, I'm sorry, the United States is actually below the highest life expectancy. I think there's an arrow there. And even though it is has very wasteful use of energy. And so the global north, especially the US, can degrow its energy use and actually achieve a higher life expectancy than present. Of course, there are other important factors like income inequality, which drive this bad health, particularly in the United States. Okay, so we come to implications to the agenda and strategy of a global Green New Deal. I take note first of Mike Wayne's slide, why contradictions from a previous session of this conference. The tension between what might be beneficial for capital or one sector of capital and might be disadvantageous to other capitals or sectors of capital should be noted. Further, as Cedric Duran recently put it, the left must be flexible enough to seize any political opportunity that will advance the cause of a democratic ecological transition. So in the first stage of a global Green New Deal, a plausible strategy has its priority to defeat fossil capital and its political instruments in an alliance with green capital and with the transnational working class progressively taking the lead. While degrowthists wisely argue for reducing energy consumption in energy wasteful US, in a transition to renewables, they claim that global energy use should go down, which I already pointed to. But if increasingly formed by an eco-socialist agenda, a global Green New Deal will entail sustainable economic growth, the creation of a wind solar energy capacity replacing fossil fuels, restoration of natural ecosystems, agroecologies, green infrastructure, etc. Here is Georgescu Rogan, the father of ecological economics, who's had a big influence on degrowth thinking. And in particular, his fallacious so-called fourth law, which conflates open and closed systems with respect to energy and mass transfers. This fourth law was actually rejected over 30 years ago, even by leading ecological economic scholars who recognized that incoming solar radiation could be the energy source of global civilization. I'll skip over the his actual formulation of the fourth law, but just to point out that this conflation of isolated and closed systems did not recognize that the biosphere is essentially closed to transfers of matter, but it is not isolated with respect to energy flux, particularly solar energy. And so, informed by this entropy law, so-called law, degrowth has failed to recognize a critical difference between high efficiency capture of solar flux, generating wind solar power, and the fossil fuel energy supply. The Earth system is open to transfers to and from space of energy, but it's effectively closed to mass transfer. Hence, the use of fossil fuel and nuclear fission power to drive the economy can be transcended in an open Earth system by sufficient creation of high efficiency collection of the solar flux to Earth. And then this solar power will then pay its so-called entropic debt to space as non-incremental waste heat without driving us to tipping points to catastrophic climate change. And briefly, and I only have a couple of minutes left, but extractivism is a real challenge that must be confronted, and in a wind solar transition, terminating fossil fuels, in order to create a truly just process which protects the rights and health of indigenous people around the world, along who are most affected actually by extractivism, along with the workforce and communities affected. And it should be recognized as significant future opportunities to limit mining in this transition, namely recycling the huge supplies of metals now embedded in the fossil fuel and military infrastructures, substituting common elements for rare ones, such as batteries, using sodium sulfur instead of lithium, enhancing public transit instead of relying on manufacturing hundreds of millions of electric cars. And as the renewable energy supplies grow, they're using this energy to recycle without the negative impacts of fossil fuels. These opportunities reinforce the need for a renewable energy transition, increasingly informed by the eco-socialist agenda, especially global demilitarization and social governance of production and consumption. A sufficient global solar and wind energy supply greater than the present consumption level can eliminate energy poverty, raise the global life expectancy to the world's highest level, while creating the capacity for climate mitigation and adaptation, facilitating the virtual end of extractive mining by recycling and industrial ecologies, opening a path to electrified solar communism in the 21st century. And I'm combining my formulation of solar communism with that of Matt Hooper's electrified communism. And just a closing slide, I will share this as a PDF with anyone interested, but this is more details on mitigation strategies which compare degrowth versus good growth strategy. And in the interest of time, I'll just show the book website of my oldest son, Peter, who's also a climate scientist, and which goes into much more detail. And my more recent book this year, The Global Solar Commons, The Future That Is Still Possible, which is more user-friendly to readers. And you can download that with a free PDF from this link. And this is my email again if you want a presentation. I'm sorry if I went over time. That I messed up on the on the screen share. So thank you, and I'm done.
Okay. Thank you very much, David. If you could unshare your screen.
Yes, definitely.
While you're doing that, since we're talking about solar power, as I was saying to the speakers before we started, I want to bring everybody's attention to an article we published on our blog on historicalmaterialism.org recently by Daniela Rus. It's called Główna, or the Chief Administration of the Sun. And it's a fascinating archival find about a letter sent by a guy called Kozmin, who was an engineer, writing to Lenin in 1921, talking about wind power and sun power, solar power. And Lenin was very enthusiastic about that at the time. Unfortunately, like many things after the Russian Revolution, it got buried. Okay, so the next speaker then is Camilla Royle. Camilla is a fellow at the London School of Economics, and she is she's published widely in International Socialism and other journals on Engels, on dialectics of nature, and so on. And her most recent piece is the piece on climate and migration that she published in International Socialism Journal, which we can find online at International Socialism, isj.org.uk. Okay, great. So Camilla's paper is entitled Climate Justice, Migration and the State. What should we say about environmental refugees? Camilla.
Thank you. So Sebastian alluded to the COP talks at the very start of this session, and I think, although not many of us expected anything particularly great to come out of them, I think they were pretty much a disaster, really. Our world leaders have put us on track for 2.4 degrees of warming at least, which is catastrophic, really. If there's anything positive that's come out of it, it's the idea that climate change is a social justice issue and an anti-racist issue is becoming more dominant within environmental activism and in some of the protests that we've seen over the past couple of weeks. So the COP26 coalition, they sort of organised the protest, a coalition of different organisations, organised the protests here in Britain. They framed all of their activities around climate justice. It was on the demonstration in London last Saturday. Possibly people watching were also on some of these protests. There's a big anti-racist bloc in Glasgow and in London and on many of the other protests. Sudanese protesters joined. There was some anti-war mobilisation. Indigenous people were at the forefront of it, of course. And placards with slogans about refugees being welcome were very popular. You can see lots of people carrying these. So I think it's quite a positive shift away from the idea that the climate movement should just be about climate action, that it should primarily deal with climate change and reducing emissions and not be concerned with these wider social justice issues. This is from a protest last year, Climate Justice is Migrant Justice, called by a group called Global Justice Rebellion, where we all sat outside on the ground outside the Home Office, and I think a couple of people chained themselves to the gates outside the front of it as well. And you had a range of speakers, many of them migrants from migrant backgrounds themselves. Protests of, I've heard from Greek friends that protests of refugees have been quite a prominent part of climate demonstrations there as well. Are these people kind of right to talk about climate refugees? Well, I think we can say with some certainty that there will be people displaced when there are being people being displaced by climate change. There's kind of the most widely cited sort of figure talks about 200 million people per year being displaced by climate change by mid-century 2050, which is about a tenfold increase on current rates of global displacement. The academic who came up with this figure does admit, though, that it's a big extrapolation to come up with this figure, but that is one that you hear around kind of as a rough estimate. What we do know with more certainty is that even now, what you might call disasters or hazards are a bigger reason for people to be displaced, to leave their homes, than conflict is at the moment. So this is just from last year in 2020. So according to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre, there's about 40 million displaced people last year, about a quarter of them due to conflict in the orange, and the rest of them due to what they've called disasters. And you see quite prominent within those statistics as well are weather-related disasters, especially storms and floods. And these are the kind of things that we can, I think, reasonably expect to get worse with climate change. So, because warmer temperatures means more moisture in the air, contributes to extreme heavy rain, particularly in Southeast Asia. Risk of wildfires goes up with warming. Flooding becomes more likely as sea levels rise, and it's probable that tropical storms are becoming more intense. Heat waves, for obvious reasons, are also likely to increase. People being displaced for these reasons won't legally be considered refugees according to the current legal system. And the UN Convention on Refugees only considers people to be refugees if they are fleeing persecution of some kind, and if that persecution means they have to leave the state where they were and move to another state. So it doesn't really take into account people moving for environmental reasons. But we've got a bit of a problem, haven't we? Because it's not just us talking about climate and migration. It's also some of the worst people have also been talking about this. So Boris Johnson, right before the COP talks, made this extraordinary speech in Rome, where he said that with climate change, you produce shortages, you produce desertification, habitat loss, movements, contests for water, for food, huge movements of peoples. These are things that are going to be politically very, very difficult to control. When the Roman Empire fell, it was largely as a result of uncontrolled immigration. The empire could no longer control its borders. People came in from the east all over the place, and we went into a dark ages. Europe went into a dark ages that lasted a very long time, and the point of that is that it can happen again. He's said stuff like this before. He's talked about huddled masses arriving at the borders, and I'm sure people will notice the kind of the racist association with the East as a source of danger and darkness. Many people have pointed out that this is completely historically inaccurate as well, that the Roman Empire fell for a whole range of related reasons and quite complex, and the kind of modern imperative to protect borders would not have made much sense back that long ago anyway. That's a kind of modern institution, that you have nations and borders. But regardless of whether the analogy is accurate, I mean, look at how he talks about control and migration being uncontrolled. I think this kind of rhetoric sort of equates civilization with control. So in a world where we're faced with phenomena that seem like out of our control, so global pandemics, wildfires, desertification, methane escaping somewhere in the Siberian permafrost, and there are all these processes going on. I mean, this kind of treats migration as another on the list of these many terrible things that are supposedly going to happen, these supposedly sort of natural events that are uncontrolled. It creates a distinction between civilization and humanity on one side, and sort of wild, untamed nature, of which the imagined migrants are part of the nature. These people whose population is supposed to be spiraling out of control according to these kind of Malthusian imaginations, and people who are supposedly coming here to Europe. And people will be aware of the sort of political consequences. I won't have time to go in detail, but a borders and nationality bill in Britain that makes it nearly impossible for people to reach the UK and claim asylum. Similar in the US, the detention centres haven't gone away. With Biden's election, driving back Haitian migrants and all the rest of it. While within the US, Biden sort of at least says he's trying to pursue a sort of state-led green jobs investment kind of agenda. So relating to the conference theme of the return of the state, I think what we're talking about in response to climate change, which by definition is an issue that doesn't stay contained within national borders, but the response seems to involve the return of these state-led interventions, in this case, the hardening up of state borders. And it's not just Boris Johnson, it's talking about climate change as a driver of migration and conflict. And I probably won't have time to talk too much about conflict either, but I think the idea that there'll be more climate migrants, it was raised quite a lot some time ago, especially after the conflict in Darfur in Sudan in the early 2000s, often kind of described as the first climate war. It's prompted Christian Aid to produce this report, which talks about a human tide of refugees, again, quite dehumanizing language. It talks about 1 billion people being displaced by 2050. Actually also kind of supports intervention, I think even military intervention in Darfur as a response to what was happening there. So I think we need to kind of find ways to show solidarity with people facing injustice and racism, but without adopting some of the rhetoric of security and protecting borders and of a global migrant threat. And commentators on the left have rightly opposed the kind of, I'm talking about sort of left of academia, I guess more, opposed the narrative of securitization that treats migrants as a threat. So there are lots of studies that actually question whether climate change will lead to more conflict. So the evidence suggests that if you get internal migration as a response to hazards such as drought, it's not generally a big predictor of conflict. People don't necessarily turn to violence when they're faced with hardship or limited resources. Actually, in many cases, they find ways to cooperate. Others have pointed out that the narrative of climate migration obscures the complexity of the reasons why people migrate, or indeed the reasons why people remain in the same place and the nature of that migration. So, migration isn't always in one direction. It can be temporary, for example, seasonal. And often migration we're talking about is internal within a state rather than people crossing borders or crossing continents. And I think also people do point out that we shouldn't conflate hazards with disasters, that it's not inevitable that when you get a natural hazard like a flood or an earthquake, that it will lead to a disaster. You get a magnitude 7 earthquake in Japan that can cause very few injuries and limited damage, whereas a magnitude 7 earthquake in Haiti, which would killed thousands of people earlier this year. So, whether a hazard turns into a disaster is dependent on how vulnerable people are and people's capacity to cope with what is happening to them. But I do think, perhaps we could discuss this more, but I think that sometimes people, when they're responding to this kind of securitized narrative, they can go too far in emphasizing the social aspects of disasters and playing down the reality, that the material reality of hazards, and that they are going to increase, and what this is going to mean as climate change gets worse. Because I think it is difficult to dispute at the end of it that there will be more displaced people due to this. If you're completely questioning the whole idea that there'll be climate migrants, I think that will potentially have limited appeal to climate justice activists that are on the ground campaigning over this kind of thing. So I think sort of by way of a conclusion, I think what we need is sort of research that connects the perpetrators of climate change with the outcome. So what we have is a situation where the result of fossil fuel extraction in terms of worsening hazards, often in the global south, not exclusively, but often in the global south, due to climate change takes place at a distance in space and time from where the perpetrators are. So to think about how to link all of these things that are happening. So the fact that it's the global race to control supplies of fossil fuels and extract and burn more fossil fuels that leads to vulnerability in the south and other parts of the world. quite often actually in some of the same places that are feeling the effects of climate change. I think we're going to talk more about imperialism, but look at somewhere like Afghanistan that's faced decades of war. It's also not uniquely, but is exceptionally vulnerable to drought as well at the same time, ultimately as a result of the burning of fossil fuels. We just have to contend that some of the kind of renewable energy projects that we might like, the idea of potentially things like Desertec, which aims to supply renewable energy to Europe from North Africa, it's also been really criticised as well, because it's seen as a neo-colonialist project that is carried out without the democratic involvement of people in the region, and is really inappropriate, as people like Hamza Hamishen from Algeria have pointed out, that it's in an area of North Africa that's a really water-stressed region, and they want to use that water for cooling solar installations. But that is related to the migrant issue as well, because this is explicitly about development in North Africa in order to reduce the number of economic migrants to Europe. And that's part of its aim of why they're doing this. So I think that I mentioned Hamza's work. I think this is kind of really important work, because he talks about talking about climate change and migration, not playing down what's happening, but addressing climate change through a justice lens rather than a security lens, because, as he says, a future framed around security subjugates our struggles to a conceptual and imaginative framework that ultimately re-empowers the state's repressive power.
Thanks very much, Camilla. Okay, so the next paper is by Feyzi Ismail, who is a lecturer at Goldsmiths, a long-term friend of historical materialism conferences, and who has a very classy minimalist background. And Feyzi's paper is entitled The Ecological Costs of Imperialism and War.
Thanks, Sebastian, and thanks, HM, for giving me the opportunity. I wanted to focus this intervention in a very preliminary way, it must be said, on imperialism and war as key drivers of the climate crisis, and how imperialist powers not only continue to seek military solutions to economic competition, but are actually ramping up defense spending, in particular to counter China, but on a global level as well. And one important example of this is the new AUKUS alliance between Australia, the UK, and the US, which is probably the biggest defense partnership since the Second World War, to rival China for control of the South China Sea. It was signed barely a month after the US exit from Afghanistan and barely a month before COP26. I think this in itself demonstrates one of the most important challenges for the climate movement. And as well, I just want to touch on the absurdity of greening the military, which some have put forward, which is akin to the limited and ultimately impotent consumerist and market solutions to the crisis. And I want to argue that the climate movement needs to put demilitarization as well as labor exploitation in polluting industries, which includes the military sphere, at the core of its demands. Both workers in polluting industries and beyond, and soldiers in imperialist armies, have a crucial role in reversing the crisis, with protests and strikes as key weapons at our disposal. So on one level, given the scale of military emissions, it's almost enough to say that if we want to reverse the climate crisis, we have to be anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist. And that really is the long and the short of the argument. To understand what drives the capitalist system, which is the need to expand production and consumption on a competitive basis with the use of military force to defend geostrategic interests and control over resources, means the need to address the sources of the crisis. We have ruthless competition to not just keep things as they are, but unending war that is by definition unwinnable and that is depleting natural resources in the process. it is a huge step forward then, if long overdue, that the climate movement is now recognizing the ecological costs of war. And we saw this at COP26. The anti-war and the anti-nuclear movements are also at the same time stepping up by focusing on the climate. Though there are, of course, reasons to oppose war even beyond greenhouse gas emissions. Emissions aren't necessarily, in that sense, the most important impact of war compared to, say, the immediate loss of life. But given that they are implicated in the slow violence against populations in the global north and south, it is right that the movements build on the connections already being made. The self-reinforcing element that the climate crisis means an increase in war, which itself is responsible for accelerating heating and draining funds away from technical and scientific research and investment in clean energy. Imperialist war has, of course, also made it impossible for countries that are occupied to take measures to deal with toxic emissions or mitigate or adapt to its effects. And of course, the climate crisis is reinforcing inequality between countries and classes, as it also reinforces geopolitical inequality and foments further war. The takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban is perhaps the quintessential example of this. So what is the scale of military emissions? The climate and ecological crisis is nothing if not historical, but to measure the exact scale over the past century and a half of colonialism and imperialism is almost impossible. Similarly, to measure the scale of toxins unleashed on populations through fuel-intensive fighting, explosives and chemicals, transport in the form of tanks, planes, aircraft carriers, and other vehicles, weapons testing, the maintenance of military bases, and so on. None of this is measured. And the fact that the military is excluded from scrutiny shows how committed governments are to militarism. Military emissions, of course, were excluded from the Kyoto Protocol by militaries being automatically exempt from national carbon emissions targets. They're obviously easy to get around in the loopholes of the Paris Agreement, and those loopholes have not been closed in Glasgow because reporting is still voluntary. National reporting also does not extend to include the procurement of military equipment and other supply chains that account for the majority of military emissions. And this is important because, on average, the emissions from the supply chain can be more than 5 times higher than direct emissions. So there are increasing studies trying to measure and in some sense account for all of this. Researchers at Durham and Lancaster universities estimate that in 2017, the US military purchased more than 269 barrels of oil a day. And in that same year, the US Air Force purchased over $4.9 billion worth of fuel. The US Navy purchased $2.8 billion worth of fuel. Globally, literally trillions are spent each year on militaries. The top 40 industrialized countries spend about $1.27 trillion, spent about $1.27 trillion in 2020 alone. And it was reported recently in the mainstream media that, according to Scientists for Global Responsibility, the world's militaries combined, along with the industries that provide their equipment, are estimated to create 6% of all global emissions. And this is while, according to a now quite cited report by the Watson Institute at Brown University, says that the US Department of Defense continues to be the world's largest institutional consumer of petroleum and the world's largest institutional producer of greenhouse gases. Let's not forget also that the US military is spread over 800 bases across 70 countries. There have also been a few early studies produced after the launch of the war on terror, after 9/11, attempting to sort of quantify the amount of emissions attributed to war. And this is important work. I mean, they show the scale of emissions, the damage caused, and what could have been spent elsewhere. George Bush along with launching the war on terror, also attacked public health and environmental protections at the same time, including removing restrictions on road construction in national forests, on the destruction of wetlands and so on mining metals and minerals in public lands and so on and on. There is also a fairly early book in 2009 called The Green Zone by Barry Sanders, which painstakingly attempts to measure the extent of pollution caused by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, that was more than 10 years ago now. But speaking about the effects of depleted uranium, including the long-term damage to the very soil upon which people depend to grow food. He writes most of the depleted uranium dust particles measure less than 1.5 microns, small enough for Iraqi men, women, and especially children to take into their systems through their pores, their mouths, and most destructively through their nostrils, a most deadly source of internal radiation. And he goes on to write, imagine a good portion of the country of Iraq then covered with a fine film of highly toxic U-238 isotope. I can assign no number to this kind of pollution. It registers on no known scale, so difficult to fathom. The idea barely registers in the ordinary person's imagination. And he calculates that this isotope has a half-life of 4.5 billion years. So scientists can only make estimates of the effects. Afghanistan, of course, also was a war of choice. Yet the effects are no less catastrophic. 46 bombs per day were dropped on Afghanistan for 20 years at a cost of $2.2 trillion. And in 2002, a researcher from Afghanistan commented that losses of natural resources are beyond estimation. Damage to the environment is second only to human loss. And he predicted that if the war continued, the bombing and related fires could wipe out the entirety of the country's forests. And that was almost 20 years ago. So there is truth to the idea that there are few activities on the planet that are environmentally catastrophic as waging war, and no amount of tinkering will reduce the environmental impact of war. So arguing for a more energy efficient military is not the way forward. As Reich and Schwartzman argue in their 2008 research, a leaner, greener military is still a military, and an unjust war fought with hybrid Humvees, eco-friendly tanks, and hydrogen-powered fighter jets would still be unjust. So, of course, there have been suggestions that greening the military would make a difference. Senator Elizabeth Warren most famously came up with a plan in 2019 requiring the Pentagon to achieve net zero carbon emissions for all its non-combat bases and infrastructure by 2030. A couple of years later, NATO Secretary General wakes up to the fact that the world's militaries emit a considerable amount of greenhouse gases and suggests that tanks should go green by adding solar panels. I mean, those efforts are so pathetic and uninteresting that we barely need to comment on them. But committing militaries to reduce greenhouse gases, if that's even possible, will not solve the crisis, but nor is the solution just about ending the secrecy around emissions produced by militaries and reporting them at COP27, as some have suggested. It has to be about ending the imperialist wars that account for those emissions in the first place. And yet we're seeing exactly the opposite. In most countries, the military is by far the most polluting wing of government. According to CIPRI, global military spending rose more than $2 trillion in 2020. And I mentioned the AUKUS Pact, which was announced in September this year, which involves the procurement of nuclear submarines by Australia, along with the sharing of intelligence and information and technology between these three countries. But it makes Australia the 7th country in the world with the ability to operate nuclear-powered submarines. And geopolitically, of course, binds Australia to the US and UK. Defenders of this alliance have described it as an effort to protect shared values against those of China. And we heard the same declarations that we heard at the start of the war on terror, that this arrangement will keep us safer, it will reduce the risk of war with China, and so on. But really, it is about intervention in the South China Sea, most of which China claims to control, but because of its pivotal position in trade routes. It carries a third of global shipping, which is worth over £3 trillion. It's estimated to have very large reserves of oil and gas, lots of fish. And so it's an extremely contested region. And China is already building bases in the South China Sea while the US is sending warships there. And all of this comes at a time when Boris Johnson announced earlier this year that this is the end of the era of retreat for Britain, or what he sees as retreat for Britain, and that the Tories would increase military spending over the next 4 years by over £24 billion. So if you read things like the new Global Britain report, which is the government's so-called integrated review of security, defence, development and foreign policy, it's a sickening read, but it foregrounds defence and security. And of course, even if, where is that money being spent? Even if the US and UK have left Afghanistan and scaled down in Iraq, there is remote warfare to cover up business as usual. So the technology to intervene is still there. So finally, just to think about, what is to be done, it's clear that challenging the climate crisis and war are part of one struggle, but they must be connected to bigger social and economic change in society. And I think over the past few years, I think students and young people have reminded through the school, the youth climate strikes and the school student strikes have reminded trade unionists of the power of the strike. And if the exploitation of labor and the exploitation of nature are inseparable, then it goes without saying that the key to stopping the exploitation of nature is stopping the exploitation of labor. And of course, this can only be done by labor itself. So we can all watch the COP process every year, but it will never deliver what we need, which is the biggest working class resistance possible at national levels and ultimately at the global level, combined with the mass movements that we've seen, both climate related and those not directly related to the climate. So working class resistance can be resistance against wages, it can be resistance against working conditions, both in polluting industries and non-polluting industries. But it has to be collective, challenging industries and sectors, not only as protesters from the outside, but as workers on the inside of those sectors and industries. And it's heartening that trade unions are beginning to raise issues of the climate crisis at national level in workplaces and on protests. And I think workers and trade unionists are drawing the connections. And I think it's a huge step forward that the left needs to build on.
Okay, thank you very much, Feyzi. So the final paper is by Jordan Kinder. Jordan is a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Art History and Communication Studies at McGill University and a citizen of the Métis Nation of Alberta. Jordan's paper is entitled "The Canadian Extractive State Apparatus in the Pandemic Present." Jordan. I think you should unmute yourself.
Yep. Yeah, sorry, I was just bringing my screen up. You can see my screen fine though, right? I'll get started here. So first of all, thanks for having me today. And thanks especially to the organizers and those who have made time on a weekend to attend this panel. This is my second time at Historical Materialism. The other time was in 2017. And the conference proved to be a productive atmosphere to think more deeply about questions of theory, method, and practice in my own work with comrades well-versed in historical materialism and Marxist thought more generally. I'll open my talk today with a land acknowledgement. I'm zooming in from St. Henry, a neighborhood in the southwest borough of Montreal, a city whose lands and waters are on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka peoples. Montreal, or Tiohtià:ke in Kanien'kehá:ka, has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among diverse indigenous nations and peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. Since the pandemic started, I've been using this picture on screen here. I took of an abandoned barley malting factory beside the Lachine Canal that I pass by often. So the Lachine was an instrumental waterway in Montreal's rise as an industrial hub in the 19th century, and now straddles a fine line between an industrial and post-industrial landscape, since it has been designated as a National Historic Site, yet is still host to industrial production such as concrete factories. So some 5 kilometers away, where you can rent paddle boats and bikes in the summer, concrete and steel is still being produced. So with that said, I'll move on to the talk proper. After using the COVID-19 pandemic as an opportunity to suspend environmental regulations, Alberta, Canada's Energy Minister Sonia Savage suggested during an interview on the Canadian Association of Oil Well Drilling Contractors podcast that restrictions on gatherings due to the pandemic make it a great time to be building a pipeline. Savage's remarks bring into relief the degree to which states are committed to the ongoing reproduction of fossil and extractive capital. Even during a global pandemic, the construction of pipelines remains a priority. In the wake of Savage's comments, this paper I'll be presenting today returns to Louis Althusser's thesis that the reproduction of capitalism occurs in part through ideological and repressive state apparatuses, to offer an analysis of the persistence of fossil and extractive capital as sedimented in unjust energy infrastructures. My talk today hinges upon the proposition and preliminary theorization of the extractive state apparatus to conceptualize the ways in which the contemporary extractive and fossil capital regimes are reproduced materially and ideologically, particularly through energy infrastructure, and how we might resist that reproduction. To do so, I'll be looking to 2 infrastructural pursuits in Canada's pipeline, past and present. The first being the unrealized Mackenzie Valley natural gas pipeline project, which was put forward by a consortium of oil and gas companies named Canadian Arctic Gas Limited in the 1970s, and the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline project, which is now under ownership of the Government of Canada. So I'll approach both of these as sites to excavate the political, economic, social, and ecological relations of extractive and fossil capitalism as expressed through state and extra-state craft, that is, through extractive state apparatuses. And so I'll note as an aside that in my kind of due diligence of searching around to see if people have used this formulation before, it has been used in sort of casual mention in a couple pieces alongside a mentioning of repressive state apparatuses, but hasn't been sort of theorized in any capacity. Althusser writes in the preface of On the Reproduction of Capitalism, titled To My Readers and first published, I think in 1970, the following: 100 years from now, perhaps only 50 years from now, the face of the world will have changed. The revolution will have carried the day from one end of the earth to the other. Some 50 years from Althusser's now, however, revolutionary possibilities are at once more bleak, yet as a result, more needed than ever as we collectively, if unevenly, feel the heat released by a burning planet. In the face of ever accelerating planetary warming, we live, to use Andreas Malm's prescient words that I return to often, in the heat of this ongoing past. Malm's observations contain within them a sort of implicit call to perform histories of the present vis-a-vis an energy capital nexus attuned to historical materialism that confronts and helps to dismantle fossil capitalism. Today, I take up this call in the context of 2 Canadian pipeline projects separated by the same period from Althusser's 50-year revolutionary speculative optimism, the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Project and the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline Project. But in taking up this call, I recognize that the project of fossil and extractive capitalism in Canada is also a settler colonial project. So resistance must be attuned to this reality, since settler colonialism functions as an ongoing past in its own right. These two pipeline projects are intimately connected. If realized, they would be constructed across vast swaths of ceded and unceded territory, that is, treated and untreated indigenous territory. They would also establish energy corridors that propel what political economist Don Boudreaux has called energy deepening, or the general historical trend of the intensification of the production and consumption of energy. First proposed in the early 1970s, the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline project has undergone 3 separate iterations, all of which have yet to be realized. As Yellowknives Dene theorist Glenn Coulthard points out, the pipeline would be the largest private sector development project in the history of Canada and quite possibly the world. The first proposal of this project in the 70s faced a series of delays after the Government of Canada commissioned an inquiry to examine the social, environmental, and economic impacts of the pipeline. Led by Justice Tom Berger, and also known as the Berger Inquiry, the commission recommended that the pipeline be delayed for 10 years in order to resolve outstanding Indigenous land claims and establish conservation areas that would necessitate rerouting the path to mitigate its impact on sensitive ecosystems in the Northern Yukon in particular. So this initial 10-year delay cast over the pipeline project a perpetual uncertainty that would underwrite each of its 3 possible iterations that have yet to be realized. The Trans Mountain expansion is an approved under construction expansion to an existing bitumen pipeline built in 1953 initially, that runs 1,150 kilometers from a tar sands refinery in Strathcona County, Alberta, to Canada's west coast in Burnaby, British Columbia. This expansion will twin the current line, increasing capacity from 300,000 to 890,000 barrels per day. Initially owned by Texas-based Energy Infrastructure Corporation, Kinder Morgan, and I'm not related to Kinder Morgan in any capacity. It was purchased by the Canadian federal government in 2018 for $4.5 billion, amid uncertainties brought on by economic circumstances, including both oil price volatility and claims to jurisdiction over Secwepemc territory that the pipeline traverses, in particular by the Tiny House Warriors, a group of Secwepemc land defenders who are building mobile tiny houses strategically across the route of the Trans Mountain expansion. And these resistance efforts I'll close with reference to as a point of sort of inspiration and my own revolutionary speculative optimism. Infrastructures are world-building creatures in their own right, as they often serve as a projection of future relations to be made material. As Hannah Appel, Nikhil Anand, and Akhil Gupta write in the introduction to their book, The Promise of Infrastructure, quote, "New infrastructures are promises made in the present about our future. Such a future-oriented prospect conditioned by promise brings into view the seductive cultural narrative that often follows fossil fuel infrastructure from promise to realization. For the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline, these promises were primarily economic ones of progress and prosperity that sat at the confluence of settler colonialism and infrastructural inertia, propelled by wage labor-based urban industrial capitalist relations of the South, set against those of a subsistence-based mixed economy of primarily indigenous peoples in the North, the Dene, Inuit, and Métis. Beyond the baked-in promises for government and industry, mediated by the extractive state apparatus, are those promises of economic enrichment for the existing Northern population. So seen in the view provided by this historical context, the spectral promises of hydrocarbon proletarianization is a veil for the settler colonial impetus of extractive and fossil capital. It is telling in this way that in the communities of the Mackenzie, a book that's the result of feasibility reports by the architecture firm Van Ginkel Associates, which was produced for the consortium Canadian Arctic Gas Limited, they implicitly base their speculative future that would be realized by this pipeline in the ideal image of a liberal individual subject free to choose between wage labor or subsistence land-based living, as if the latter were not threatened by the former. And so on screen here, we have a quotation directly taken from the book that sort of shows this tension and sort of the promise that's being offered here. So in his own report titled Northern Frontier, Northern Homeland, Justice Berger details how the energy corridor that would open the floodgates to endless subsumption of labor under extractive capitalism would destabilize existing ways of life of the Dene, Inuit, and Métis. Political theoretical commentary of the day does not mince words on these terms, as for instance, Ted Jackson describes in a powerful 1978 piece on pipeline imperialism, where he states that there would be a genocidal impact of a northern pipeline on the Dene and other indigenous people of the Arctic, particularly the result of devastating caribou herds and sort of other ecological impacts upon which subsistence living depended. In the pandemic present, some 50 years later, not much has changed as repressive and ideological state apparatuses continue to serve the reproduction of fossil and extractive capitalism. Just before the pandemic took hold, a series of demonstrations in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en people experiencing raids by the RCMP were held across Canada under the banner Shut Down Canada, including a blockade of a rail line on Tyendinaga Mohawk territory that halted rail traffic for 2 weeks. In response to these energies of resistance, the government of Alberta put forward Bill 1, called the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act, which, and this is a direct quote from the act, protects essential infrastructure from damage or interference caused by blockades, protests, or similar activities, which can cause significant public safety, social, economic, and environmental consequences. So as the repressive state apparatus allies with its extractive one, the government of Alberta simultaneously criminalized dissent and resistance while making pipelines, railways, and mines equivalent to, say, hospitals. And this sort of act came on the heels of persistent criminalization of Indigenous resistance through surveillance and sort of other repressive state mechanisms, as outlined in an excellent book by Andrew Crosby and Jeffrey Monahan called Policing Indigenous Movements, Dissent and the Security State. So ongoing modes of primitive accumulation lay bare the realities of dispossession and the false promises of proletarianization, so central to extractive capitalist world building in settler states like Canada. And these relations are reproduced by repressive and ideological state apparatuses that I suggest can and should be viewed as part of a larger extractive state apparatus as well. So my proposition is this, that the socially and ecologically destructive relations made all the more visible and acutely felt in the current conjuncture of overlapping crises as capital and capitalist states desperately hold on to fossilized energy regimes, demand a returning to and refiguring of repressive and ideological state apparatuses through extractive state apparatuses. So as a material historical process and metaphor for exploitation, extraction has received heightened critical attention in the past decade or so within Marxist circles and outside of them. Sandro Mazandra and Brett Nielsen perhaps most clearly express this tendency of an expanded concept of extraction and its consequences. Mazandra and Nielsen scale out from, quote, literal understandings of extraction as the plundering of natural resources to, quote, work towards an expanded definition that allows them to explore how some of the most prominent and forceful operations of capital today rely on material practices of prospecting and extraction. Of course, when deployed primarily as an analytic metaphor, the limits of what counts as extractive is obscured. And afterward to a recent special issue of Cultural Studies on Extraction from literary and cultural theorist Imre Zeman and Jennifer Wenzel points precisely to this problem, as the title of their piece questions, what do we talk about when we talk about extraction? So when so many social and economic processes are deemed to be extracted, in other words, is the category politically activating or is it politically restraining? Even in the face of a risk of dematerializing extraction and obscuring capitalism as the premier site of critique, there remains for me a productive allure in thinking an expanded notion of extraction and its ideological corollary of extractivism in terms of the reproduction of capitalism. Althusser posits that it is exploitation which ultimately conditions capitalist relations of production, exploitation that emerges out of capitalist capture of surplus value. To what degree is Althusser's exploitation imbricated with or conditioned by extraction? And to what degree is exploitation in these ways a fundamentally extractive relation? Moving this point forward, Althusser's thesis that superstructural relations, those in repressive and ideological state apparatuses, are responsible for reproducing the relations of production of a dominant mode of production, then it follows that we can read extractive state apparatuses along these lines. In this way, and this is kind of the larger takeaway of the concept as I've been approaching it and developing it, the extractive state apparatus highlights the possibilities for solidarity between class struggle and the struggle of indigenous peoples against ongoing dispossession. So as we were sold a green capitalist vision of the future by state figureheads and mining CEOs, highlighting extraction in these ways is politically pertinent. Indeed, the Government of Canada's designation of critical minerals, a set of 31 minerals considered critical for the sustainable and economic success of Canada and its allies, and to position Canada as the leading mining nation, and that's language lifted directly from the report announcing this designation, brings into view the stakes of this sort of problematic and conjuncture, as old and new extractivisms are central to this green capitalist future as raw material and fuel for capitalist forces and relations of production. So this designation of critical minerals allows for smoother deployment of repressive state forces to protect these resources, all while intensified resource extraction is being dressed up as a kind of nation building project. I'll close with a sort of brief sort of meditation here. In a 1976 response to reception of his Ideological State Apparatuses essay, Althusser clarified how his further elaboration of how a dominant mode of production reproduces its relations of production through repressive and ideological state apparatuses as politically activating rather than, as reception had suggested to that point, immobilizing or cynical. In Althusser's view, the levels that comprise the topology of both base and superstructure are sites and horizons of struggle. So the notion of extractive state apparatuses, like Althusser's formulation, is developed as both a point of critique here and as mobilization for struggle. And my intervention on these terms is indebted to Martin Arbeleda's recent theorization of plebeian consciousness and what he calls the universal elu, as a way to think through revolutionary subjectivity under extractive capitalism in Latin America. Similarly to the struggles that he outlines, modes of resistance and struggles for self-determination in what is now called Canada, such as those of the tiny house warriors, need not be viewed as threats to the working class, which is a position often leveraged by the architects and allies of the extractive and fossil economies in order to stoke division. So if the current pandemic is a great time for deepening extractive capitalism, then it is equally a great time to build coalitions to struggle against those committed to futures of extractive foreclosure in order for us to build futures of possibility instead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jordan. Okay, so we have some questions coming in on the YouTube chat. You have plenty of time to continue to type them in. If you want to ask a question or make an intervention, there's a whole exchange. But it would be good also to give the speakers an opportunity to respond to each other. One direct question to David is from Pritam Singh, who says, outright denunciations of degrowth should be replaced by nuanced eco-socialist position, which recognized the importance of degrowth against economic growth as the mantra of bourgeois economics. Then there's a comment from Prester John saying climate change is a Western mind issue. Yes, leaders are currently responsible, but the psychology of total environmental annihilation is unique to Westerners as a whole. It is not limited to quote unquote leaders. And there is some continuing exchange on that subject on the chat. Who would like to intervene first, either in response to those or to each other's papers? David?
I could,
or Jordan, go ahead. Yeah.
well, I could reply very briefly to the point about climate change being a Western mind issue. I think the kind of most of the papers that have been presented on the panel today challenge that understanding of climate change being a Western mind issue for all of those inhabitants of the West, including the working class, and also that challenging the sort of framing of it as a mind issue in the first place. That's not I don't really see that as a very materialist formulation in a certain way, and it sort of I think overlooks the kind of frictions and uneven sort of characteristics of what we imagine the West to even be in the first place, as my paper at least pointed towards, is even within Canada, which has like some of the highest sort of emissions, GHG emissions per capita in the world. I think it might even be pretty close to number one. If it's not, I won't cite that directly because I don't have the stat in front of me, but it's pretty close. So even within that sort of setting, there's a sort of really uneven sort of distribution of where that responsibility lies. And so there's the framing it as a Western mind issue, I think really overlooks the kind of complex sort of sites of struggle that are occurring, and actually is kind of an immobilizing gesture in itself for sort of this kind of coalition of sort of class and indigenous struggle, at least that I've sort of outlined in my paper.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, Prester John then contradicts himself by citing IMF loans to nations of the global south, which are hardly an emanation of the Western mind, unless one has a very capacious understanding of what the Western mind is. David, yeah, you wanted to?
Yes, I want to respond to Dr. Singh, who I think I met at a previous HM conference. I agree. We should distinguish between and unpack the concept of economic growth. What is good growth? What is, as I emphasized in my presentation, what is good and what is bad? Certainly, we should emphasize degrowing and terminating the military-industrial complex and its imperialist agenda, which is really blocking any chance of achieving the 1.5 degree warming target. So that's my brief response. It's nevertheless, I think degrowth as a brand is not helpful without distinguishing the different kinds of growth. Thank you. Could I? Well, I'll be quiet.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Feyzi, Camilla, either of you want to come in?
Yeah, I think I agree with Pratam as well, that when we're talking about degrowth, I mean, we have to bear in mind kind of what are the degrowthers responding to. I think they're responding to a kind of eco-modernism that wants to keep society the same and just try and solve climate crisis with introducing a bit more technology, and of course they're responding to this kind of this obsession with growth, or this tendency for capitalism to prioritize growth and extraction above all else. And I think they're right to respond to those things. And I think, from what I know of the sort of degrowth people, I think like Jason Hickel's written not a terrible book and tweets some quite good things, but I think they tend to be anti-racist and tend to raise the issue of disproportionate responsibility of the global north and disproportionate impact on the global south. And I think all of those are good positive things about the degrowth agenda. I think whether we wholeheartedly agree with everything they say depends on what they mean, depends on which degrowth we're talking about, what they mean by degrowth, really, isn't it? Is it just about berating workers in the north for their supposedly high consumption, or does it address the relations of production that kind of lead to growth and are implicated in growth? I think that which kind of degrowth we're talking about kind of must have an influence on what we think about them. I think I agree that we're not talking about a Western mind issue. I think it's a capitalist issue. It's an issue related to the fossil fuel industry and its continued expansion, even though we know every sensible person knows that we need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. I think we've kind of, Jordan's talked a lot about fossil fuels, but most of us have talked about the state, because that's kind of the theme of the conference. But it's not just about world leaders; it's about the world leaders that are tied into this capitalist system, isn't it? When it comes to what do we do about it, I don't think we'll get very far by locating it as a problem with the Western mind and trying to change the Western mind. I think, I agree with what Feyzi said about looking to the movements and looking to the power of organised workers. I think it was a small action, but it was great to see that the GNB, refuse workers in Glasgow were out on strike during the COP, and that also climate activists went to the picket lines and drew links between workers' action and climate action. I guess on that point, I think since some of us are education workers, I'd like to sort of maybe ask the other panelists perhaps what we think the role for education workers is, workers who work in universities, because we probably have some strikes coming up in universities in Britain. Do we play the same role in calling for climate jobs as maybe workers in more kind of industrial industries? That might be one thing to discuss. I thought that the stuff about Indigenous struggles in Canada is fascinating. I wonder whether you had any comments about the role of about gender and Indigenous struggles. It just sort of struck me at that last kind of slide. It looked like it appeared that there were lots of women involved in that tiny house movement. So I wondered if there was any comments about that as well.
I could jump in very briefly to answer that.
Maybe Feyzi
question
first, and then.
Oh yeah, sure.
I mean, I would agree with Pritam and also Camilla's comment on what we mean by degrowth. I mean, if it is about, and I think it's kind of different people who defend degrowth are talking perhaps about different things, but at least some of it is about the focus on the consumer side of things rather than production. And I think we have to really be careful with that. It is, supply that drives demand, not the other way around. And I think, it's great that people want to change things in terms of consumer choices and everything, but and you see it a lot, but it's never going to be on the scale that is required, and it lets the real culprits obviously off the hook. So what we need is real planning at the national and global level. And obviously you can get some planning under the capitalist system, but you can't get the kind of planning that is needed on a global level or in terms of even across industries. I'm glad Camilla actually talked about workers and strikes. I mean, we are in the education sector, higher education, seeing now, and actually FE seeing more and more strikes. I'm at Goldsmiths. We're actually going to go on a 3-week strike starting 3 weeks. That's a long time. Starting on the 23rd of November over 52 redundancies. But actually, I think, and which is why I kind of just mentioned this in the presentation, it is workers both in polluting and non-polluting industries, and I think we have to sort of see it that way. Obviously, I think workers in polluting industries are absolutely key. But as Durand was saying, Cedric Durand, I think somebody had mentioned it, David, in his presentation. We need to seize all opportunities, and anything that starts to destabilize governments and states, starting at kind of smaller levels is a good thing. I mean, if we can start to kind of put that kind of pressure on governments by, as I say, destabilizing them and getting them out of power, then we can start to build confidence, I think, amongst the working class, and start to raise these issues, I think, in a more comprehensive way.
Jordan?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that in terms of women being at the forefront of the movement, this is entirely true. It wasn't just the case that this picture captured that, but that is the case across the board. I would recommend a really great article by Kim Tallbear called, I think I'm getting the title right, Badass Women Caretake Relations. That's in a collection called Standing with Standing Rock, and she really details, the sort of powerful role that women are playing in these movements for lots of reasons. In the case of the tiny house warriors, it's a project to build houses and sort of secure the possibilities for social reproduction in a certain way under the face of a kind of necropolitical extractive regime. So reoccupying traditional territory and building houses and offering places to live, while we're facing sort of housing crises that are more acutely felt in these kinds of settings, especially, is sort of all wrapped up in there. So yeah, definitely gender plays a very significant role in this that I didn't really sort of get to in my paper as sort of bookends to my analysis in this particular sort of version of this kind of sort of theoretical formulation I've been working with.
David?
Could I intervene briefly? I think Jason Hickel was mentioned, and other recent proponents of degrowth. And I agree with Camilla that they do recognize the disparities between the global North and the global South. However, their prescription for global degrowth, I think, smacks with a lot of Eurocentrism. But in particular, they point to Cuba as being a model for what energy consumption levels should be shared, per capita in the global South. Well, it so happens that Cuba is well below the minimum to achieve the highest life expectancy, which I think every child born on this planet deserves. And we should fight for that. And the reason, obviously, it falls below is because of the US imperialist embargo, a big part of it. So Cuba now, actually, the latest statistics, and it's in the article I posted on the chat, because Cuba has a significantly lower COVID death rate than the US, they've now probably surpassed the life expectancy of the United States. So now they rank about 40th in the world. Cuba ranks 40th in the world. Now, they've done remarkable things with their revolution and their agroecology and so on. But again, it should be recognized that when degrowthists point to Cuba in this respect, it is not a good prescription of what we should fight for globally. I do have a couple of questions for the rest of the panel, very briefly. And this may sound, I was in the UK for several weeks recently, and I noted that a newspaper called The Light was being freely distributed in the UK, and this was not only an anti-vax message, it was also a climate denial message. And my question is, how strong is this connection being made, in the UK and perhaps elsewhere? And as a connection, a messaging that I see really shared globally by the far right, but a neo-fascist movement, which I think the final panel is going to be talking about. One other question, the notion of that Jordan pointed to, and Camilla, regarding critical minerals and the prospect for resource wars growing out of the control of these strategic metals. Again, assuming that this, the beginning of a solar transition will be dominated by capital. Michael Clare in particular has pointed to the prospect of resource wars. So I'd really like to hear your analysis there. Thank you.
Thanks. Feyzi seems to have dropped off. Hope she can come back. Just a quick plug on the question of degrowth. Everybody read the piece in New Left Review by Kenta Tsuda called Naive Questions on Degrowth in issue 128, March, April 2001, which I thought was an excellent critique of at least some strands of degrowth theory.
Could you put that on the chat, Sebastian, please? Because I didn't.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. So Jordan or Camilla, do you want to respond to David?
I could try, I guess. I haven't come across a particular anti-vax magazine that you've come across in Britain. We do have, some anti-vaxxers here, as in many parts of the world. I think, we probably should not overstate their influence, because most people have been vaccinated here in Britain, and there are specific reasons why some communities have been reluctant to be vaccinated, including worries about immigration status and things. I think that people are worried about that, and they think that there's some, chance that their migration status might be checked when they go to get vaccinated, which doesn't happen. But if you're worried about that, it's sort of understandable why some communities have been reluctant to get vaccinated. Most people have that. There were some big protests around of the sort of anti-vaxxers, and it did combine with far right forces and even fascists on a few occasions. The specific kind of relationship between them and climate change denial, I haven't looked into that so much, but I guess
Piers Corbyn.
Yeah, Piers Corbyn.
Rather embarrassing, you should be honest about it.
I mean, he's always been like that, though. It's Jeremy Corbyn's brother. It's climate denier, climate change denier. So yeah, you're right. And I guess, but yeah, what I'm sort of getting at is, there are a group of people who will think that the state is trying to stop them doing things, is trying to force them to get vaccinated, and is trying to force them to change their lifestyle to do a climate change, and will try to resist that, I guess. So we need to kind of talk about climate change and explain the sort of truth of it, but also not do it in a way that's just about, it's going to involve hardship for you. Try and raise these issues about just transition and jobs and things, and not just say it's all about sort of hair-shirtedness, and it's just going to make things more difficult for people. I think that will win people over. The resource wars is kind of, it's a complex one, because Afghanistan, that was about control of oil, then that's a resource war, isn't it? So I think those are the kind of resource wars that we should be worried about, and that are happening. Geopolitical conflicts over control of resources. Whether ordinary people will start sort of fighting each other when water resources get scarce is something that there isn't so much evidence for, at least at the moment. And as I said, people also find ways to cooperate. So I guess this is resource wars from the state, from the top down, that we should be worried about.
Jordan or Feyzi? Feyzi, sorry about you dropping out there, but I don't know if you wanted to come back, either of you.
Yeah, I could jump in about the critical minerals thing. My sort of work is mostly relatively internal to Canada, and in some cases the US, relations between Canada and US. The critical minerals designation seems to be a sort of preemptive move to really kind of securitize existing and future extractive resource projects within the borders of Canada, in partnership with the United States. That designation was done both between the US and Canada is sort of dressing it up as a kind of nationalist project, but it's definitely being done, in the recognition that future sort of blockades, disruptions, indigenous movements of resistance could impact the viability of continued pursuits of these extractive projects, which is, as you pointed out, are sort of perceived to be necessarily intensifying in the sort of prospects of a green transition or what have you. And in fact, actually, sort of one of the interesting sort of framing points that I didn't put into my talk today, but is one that kind of inspired this work, is our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is rationalizing this Trans Mountain expansion project that I talked a bit about today, with using the sort of economic stimulus produced by that to then sort of reinvest into green transition, sort of making this kind of very dubious claim that further expansion of the fossil fuel economy is necessary to achieve some sort of green transition. In terms of the anti-vax climate change stuff, I actually know a lot about this, because in my other research life, I study the far right pro-oil movement within Canada. So you'll have seen on my sort of slide about repressive and ideological state apparatuses, there was a meme on there from a pro-oil group that said, "Balance means you support Canadian pipelines." So there's a sort of loose network of sort of dubiously grassroots pro-oil groups in Canada that I've been studying on social media. I'm actually writing a book about it right now. Anyway, long story short, one of these groups has turned into essentially a sort of anti-vax propaganda page on Facebook. And so there's a very interesting direct connection that I haven't quite sort of teased out between climate denialism, sort of this like faith in fossil capitalism, and anti-vaccination sort of COVID misinformation, in a way that is all sort of, I think it's all sort of hinging on a kind of particular far right sort of political agenda that I'm definitely still sort of sorting out to have any sort of sophisticated analysis of, but it's very interesting to see that kind of play out in real time. A group that I've been following for 4 years, very suddenly in the early stages of the pandemic, yes, spreading a lot of misinformation and actually posting more about sort of anti-vax tendencies than actually saying anything about pipelines or resources as it once was.
Okay, any final comments? Feyzi, do you want to come back? There was a question about Michael Clare and resource wars.
No, I sort of missed that discussion, but no, that's fine.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for your contributions. Several things I wanted to say in conclusion. First thing is to remind people that the closing panel, The Fascist Horizon, Theoretical and Political Perspectives, is happening at 6 o'clock GMT. I wanted to invite you all to take up the offer for subscription, as David Schwartzman did many, many years ago, to the journal. It's currently 25% discount on the individual subscription. I also wanted to encourage you to take up the opportunity of the Haymarket sale, Haymarket book sale, which includes a lot of books from historical materialism book series, including a number on ecology, including John Bellamy Foster and many others. And I will be circulating on the HM email list, which you should all be members of, a list of articles we published in the journal around ecology, going back many years now, including a recent piece by Andreas Malm and Wim Carton on direct air capture, is that what it's called? DAC, which is actually an open access article. And finally, I also wanted to encourage you all to tune in to our new initiative, which is the HM podcast, which we've had one edition of so far around the last issue of Historical Materialism, and we will at the very least be doing one for each new issue of the journal that comes out, discussing various articles that have appeared in the journal. That's available on Spotify and other platforms. So yeah, thanks all very much for participating in the panel. David, you wanted?
Well, yes,
to
I
plug
just
something,
want
I
to
imagine?
remind you, Sebastian, to put the link to that degrowth critique you mentioned on the
Yeah,
chat.
it's on the YouTube chat, but I'll send it. I've
Oh,
also sent it
okay,
in
yeah,
person.
please. I'm looking at. I did want to make a final comment, very briefly, regarding the military and its contribution to blocking, achieving the 1.5 degree warming limit. Indeed, the military globally, especially the Pentagon, does contribute a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, but it's actually less than 1% of the global. So the real obstacle that the military-industrial complex plays is its imperial agenda, which blocks cooperation, which is badly needed to achieve that warming target. And of course, as already pointed out, the huge military expenditures, $2 trillion a year, as well as other impacts that have already been mentioned. So thanks again for this opportunity. I really appreciated all of the presentations very much. I'm looking forward to seeing this again.
Okay, good. And I hope we can all meet again in person in the near future.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks very much for the session, and see you all at the final plenary. Bye.